The line between love and hate is often pretty thin, and only a short step separates the two. Likewise, marital bliss and a marriage made in hell are often separated by a thin line, and a pretty short step. Following are 20 things about disastrous love affairs and marriages from history. Number 20. From gay Paris to grim Scotland. Mary Stuart was raised Catholic. However, the Scotland to which she returned in 1561 was tearing itself apart between Catholics mounting a desperate rearguard action and increasingly assertive Protestants. There was no love lost between the two sects. Compared to the gaiety of the French court, where Mary had grown up, Scotland was a decidedly dour place. The leading Protestant reformer John Knox denounced the habits she had picked up in France of dancing, dressing too stylishly, and hearing the Catholic Mass. It was against that backdrop that Mary met an Italian nobleman, David Rizzio, who arrived with the staff of an embassy from Savoy to Scotland in 1561. Number 19. Rumors of a love affair plant the seeds for tragedy. David Rizzio, who was considered a good musician and a great singer, stood out and caught the attention of Queen Mary. A cosmopolitan and cultured courtier was a rare find in Scotland. So Mary wasted no time in snatching Rizzio up and adding him to her staff as a court musician and bass in her personal choir. By 1564, Rizzio had grown rich off the Queen's patronage and had been elevated from musician to Mary's private secretary. As private secretary, Rizzio controlled access to Mary, making him a powerful figure in his own right. That did not sit well with the Scots, who resented a foreigner, and a Catholic foreigner that wielding such clout at court. Rumors soon spread that Rizzio was abusing his power for his own benefit, and that he and the Queen had a love affair. Unfortunately for both Mary and Rizzio, they paid no attention to the rumors and did little to dispel them. That indifference would come back and bite both. Number 18. The Queen falls in love. Whatever the truth about an affair between the Queen and her private secretary, Mary's affections were soon captured by another beau, Henry Stuart. Lord Darnley was Mary's cousin, a handsome and well-proportioned young man. Darnley was 19 when he first met Mary in 1565. The Queen was captivated by her cousin, and soon fell head over heels in love with him. In addition to the attraction a marriage made dynastic sense, it would unite two branches of the Stuart line, and thus strengthen the Scottish royal family. A marriage was swiftly arranged, and Darnley ascended the throne of Scotland as king consort. Soon after the wedding, however, Mary discovered that her second husband was a spoiled brat, with an excessive sense of entitlement. Darnley grew livid when Mary refused to grant him the crown matrimonial, which would have allowed him to continue ruling after her death. When his wife got pregnant instead of being pleased, Darnley worried that an heir would push him that much further from the throne. Number 17. From love to resentment. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, became Mary's second husband and king consort of Scotland from 1565 until he died 2 years later. Darnley had accomplished little of note in his brief life. Before his violent death at age 22, his single legacy was to impregnate his wife with the future King James VI of Scotland and James I of England. The Scottish royal couple's sole offspring succeeded Queen Elizabeth I to the English throne and gave rise to the Stuart dynasty, which united England and Scotland. Darnley resented that his wife was queen, while he was a mere consort, with no independent power. His resentment grew when Mary removed from circulation the currency that had his head on it. Darnley eventually focused his rage on Mary's private secretary David Rizzio, whom he accused of turning the Queen against him, as well as being her lover. The accusation was rich, considering that Darnley was himself infamous as Scotland's most debauched and promiscuous nobleman. Indeed, his list of alleged lovers included David Rizzio. Number 16. The Queen falls out of love. Whatever the truth, if any, of a three-way bisexual love triangle between Queen Mary, Lord Darnley, and David Rizzio, the royal marriage soured within a year. By 1566, the Queen and her husband were estranged, so Darnley began plotting against Mary, who was pregnant by then. His nebulous plan was to push the Queen out of the way and take her place on the throne as King of Scotland in his own right. Whether or not he had ever been Darnley's lover, Rizzio stuck with Mary when the rift opened up between the Queen and her husband. Rizzio's loyalty to the Queen further incensed Darnley. When rumors began making the round that the child growing in Mary's womb was actually Rizzio's, Darnley's rage mounted. Eventually, the snickering at court and throughout Scotland about Darnley being a cuckold proved too much for the king consort's pride and fragile masculinity, so he decided to do something about it. That something turned out to be one of the era's most shocking public murders. Number 15. Murder in the Queen's presence. Lord Darnley conspired with a cabal of aristocrats, including his father and other nobles, to effectively carry out a Protestant coup against Mary, with David Rizzio playing the role of scapegoat. On the evening of March 9, 1566, Darnley led a group of 80 armed men and forcibly seized Mary's palace in Edinburgh, then burst into the Queen's dining room, where she was supping with her confidants, including David Rizzio. Mary was publicly accused of dishonoring her husband by conducting a love affair with her secretary. In the ensuing fracas, which entailed the Queen being held with a pistol pointed at her head, while her secretary attempted to hide behind her, Darnley and his henchmen stabbed Rizzio to death. All in all, David Rizzio was stabbed 56 times, then his corpse was unceremoniously flung down the palace's main stairs and stripped of its jewels and fine clothes. Number 14. Trying to terrify his pregnant wife into a miscarriage. While David Rizzio was getting murdered, Queen Mary was held at gunpoint by her husband's henchmen. One of them pointed a pistol at her pregnant belly, while another threatened to stab her. By murdering the Queen's secretary in her presence, Darnley had not only sought to intimidate and bend his wife to his will, but also to shock the pregnant Mary into miscarrying. Mary did not miscarry, and gave birth to the future King James in June 1566, however, between seeing her psycho husband commit bloody murder in her presence, while his sidekicks threatened to visit deadly violence upon her, and upon the baby in her womb, the Queen was understandably quite intimidated. If her love for Lord Darnley was not already dead, it died then. After the deed was done and it was all over, Mary was forced to pardon Rizzio's murderers. However, Darnley would not get away with it for long. Number 13. Such a young fool and proud tyrant should not reign. It did not take long for Lord Darnley to quarrel with his Protestant co-conspirators. Just 2 days after murdering the Queen's secretary, the Queen's husband switched back to his wife's Catholic faction. On the night of March 11th to 1566, he helped Mary escape from her palace, now teeming with Protestants. However, Darnley's change of heart was too late to rekindle love or save the marriage, which was irrevocably ruined by the murder of Rizzio. Mary neither forgot what had happened, nor forgave. After giving birth in June 1566, Mary bided her time until November of that year, when she met with her loyal nobles to figure out what to do about the problem of Darnley. They decided that the Queen's husband had to go. As described by contemporaries, it was thought expedient and most profitable for the Commonwealth that such a young fool and proud tyrant should not reign or bear rule over them, that he should be put off by one way or another, and whosoever should take the deed in hand or do it, they should defend. Number 12. Getting a new love to kill an old one. Queen Mary's leading ally in the ensuing plot to get rid of Darnley was James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, who organized a plot to assassinate Darnley. On February 19, 1567, explosives were detonated beneath Darnley's bedroom. He survived the blast, but upon staggering out of the wreckage, he was seized and strangled to death. Soon thereafter, Mary married Bothwell. The marriage turned out to be extremely unpopular, and united both Catholics and Protestants in denouncing the Queen for marrying the man who had murdered her husband. Number 11. The Queen abandoned by her latest love. Queen Mary and the Earl of Bothwell raised an army against their opponents. However, before any battle was fought, the royal couple's forces evaporated. As their men deserted them, Bothwell was allowed to leave provided he left Mary behind. Whatever love he might have felt for Mary, it was not greater than his love for his own life. Bothwell jumped at the chance to save his skin, and abandoned his wife to the tender mercies of her enemies. Mary was taken captive to Edinburgh, where she was denounced as an adulteress and murderess and imprisoned. On July 24, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. She fled to England, where she got involved in further political intrigues that ended with her beheading 2 decades later. Number 10. England's worst husband. Andrew Robinson Stoney, 1747-1810, might have been England's worst husband in the 18th century, an Anglo-Irish rake and adventurer. Stoney was a conman who gained infamy by tricking an unsuspecting noblewoman into a horrific marriage without any love, but with plenty of abuse. It was to Mary Bowes, Countess of Strathmore and Kingmore, an ancestor of Queen Elizabeth II, who became known as the Unhappy Countess. The marriage scandalized England and led to a riveting divorce case. Mary was born in London to a wealthy coal baron, who died when she was 11. He left her a fortune of about £1 million, Paris Hilton-type money in those days, that made Mary the wealthiest heiress in Europe, and one of Britain's most desirable women. Aristocrats wooed her, and she enjoyed and encouraged the attentions, before finally marrying John Bowes, 9th Earl of Strathmore and Kingmore, on her 18th birthday. Number 9. Torrid love affairs. Mary Bowes and the Earl of Strathmore and Kingmore had 5 children. However, when the Earl caught tuberculosis, Mary grew frustrated with his increasing debility and lack of sex drive. She started cheating on her husband, carried on a series of love affairs, and earned a reputation for licentiousness in the process. When the Earl finally died in 1776, the widowed Mary resumed control of her fortune and took up with a new beau, George Grey. He got her pregnant 4 times within a year, with Mary aborting each one. Number 8. No love, no problem. Mary Bowes finally resigned herself to marry George Grey after the 4th pregnancy. Then she met and was seduced by Andrew Robinson Stoney, a British Army lieutenant who styled himself a captain. Stoney wanted to get Mary to fall in love and agreed to marry him, but although she liked him, she never fell in love with him, so Stoney concocted a fiendish plan to get her to marry him, love or no love. In 1777, Stoney wrote scurrilous articles about Mary and arranged to have them published in a newspaper. He then feigned outrage over the insult to Mary's honor and challenged the newspaper's editor, who was in on the scam, to a duel. In the ensuing fake fight, Stoney pretended to have been mortally injured. Then he sprang his trap by appealing to Mary's romantic side and begging her to grant him his dying wish, her hand in marriage. Number 7. A hellish marriage. Mary Bowes was moved by the dying Stoney's romantic appeal, figuring that the marriage would only last a few hours before her new husband died. She agreed to wed Captain Stoney, who was carried down the aisle on a stretcher. Soon after the vows were exchanged and the ceremony concluded, Stoney made a miraculous recovery. In those days, husbands had the right to control their wives' finances, but Stoney discovered that a prenuptial agreement stood in the way. Undaunted, he forced Mary to revoke the prenuptial and hand control of her fortune over to him. Stoney then began squandering Mary's wealth like a drunken sailor on shore leave, and kept her a prisoner in their home. Now that she was his lawful wife, Stoney abandoned all prior efforts at getting Mary to fall in love with him. Over the next 8 years, he made her life a living hell, abusing her physically and emotionally, while raping and impregnating her maids. He also brought prostitutes home, carried on numerous consensual affairs, and fathered a brood of illegitimate children in the process. Number 6. Escape and kidnapping. Mary Bowes finally escaped in 1785 and filed for divorce. However, Stoney was not about to give up on his meal ticket that easily, so he tracked Mary down and kidnapped her. He took her to northern England, where he tortured her and threatened to rape and kill her. He also forced her to ride around the countryside on horseback during an extremely cold winter, hoping she would sicken and die. She was eventually rescued when a hue and cry was raised, and Stoney was tracked down and arrested. The divorce case, along with the criminal charges against Stoney, resumed, captivating Britain for years. Stoney and his accomplices were eventually convicted of abduction and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, and Mary finally got her divorce in 1789. Number 5. A love that shocked a nation. Camilla O'Gorman was a wealthy 19th-century Argentinian socialite and one of the most famous romantic and tragic figures of that country. She carried on a romantic relationship and marriage with a Roman Catholic priest, Father Ladislao Gutierrez, that scandalized the country and ended in tragedy for the love birds. Born in Buenos Aires, Camilla's cultivated manners, ladylike education, suave beauty, and kindly disposition were at odds with the Argentina of her day. Such traits belonged in a land of peace and beauty. Unfortunately, she lived in a brutalized country, whose dictator, an army general named Juan Manuel de Rosas, spiked town squares with the heads of political opponents, a pillar of polite society. Camilla was a friend of the dictator's daughter. When she was introduced to a Jesuit priest, Ladislao Gutierrez, something clicked between socialite and priest, and in 1847 the two fell in love and began an affair. Number 4. Love ends in tragedy. Camilla O'Gorman and Father Ladislao Gutierrez fled to a small provincial town. There, they posed as a married couple living as husband and wife, and launching the town's first school, Back in Buenos Aires, the scandal took on political tones when the dictator's opponents used it as an example of the moral decay under Rosas. A notorious womanizer, Camila and Ladislao were eventually tracked down, kidnapped and returned to Buenos Aires. Rosa's daughter pleaded for clemency for her friend, but the dictator replied that the case warranted a show of my undisputed power, as the moral values and sacred religious norms of a whole society are at stake. The dictator himself signed a decree for the lover's execution. On August 18, 1848, Camilo O'Gorman and Father Ladislao Gutierrez were executed by a firing squad in a prison town near Buenos Aires. She was 20 years old and 8 months pregnant. As a last gesture of Christian charity, she was given holy water to drink, so her baby would go to heaven. Number 3. A love that wrecked a career. Few marriages in the history of showbiz have been as catastrophic as that of Jerry Lee Lewis and Myra Gale Brown. Born and raised in Louisiana, Lewis was an early pioneer of rock and roll who began recording in 1956. The following year, he became world famous for his hit There's a Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On. Soon thereafter came his signature song, the Insta classic Great Balls of Fire, one of Rolling Stone's 100 greatest songs. By then, Lewis had already gone through 2 failed marriages. He divorced his second wife to wed for a third time, after falling head over heels in love with Myra Gale Brown. One hiccup was that she was his cousin. Although once removed, a bigger hiccup is that she was 13 years old. She still believed in Santa Claus on her wedding night. Number 2. Some good advice that he just didn't take. It was not commonplace in 1950s Louisiana to marry one's cousin or a 13-year-old girl. However, while unusual, it was not considered extreme back then. Given his background and upbringing, Jerry Lee Lewis did not think that Myra's age or her blood relation to him was a big deal, to the extent he was worried about scandal. It had more to do with the timing of the wedding. His third marriage had been performed before finalizing the divorce from his second wife. Lewis was warned not to take his child bride with him on his first European tour. Besotted with love and unwilling to part from Myra, he ignored the warning. He should have listened. Arriving in Britain in May 1958, he introduced Myra to reporters as his wife, but claimed she was 15, still shockingly young. Myra made it worse by remarking that 15 was not too young to marry, because where she came from, you can marry at 10, if you can find a husband. Number 1. A fierce backlash. Once the press on both sides of the Atlantic discovered Myra's true age, the backlash was fierce. The British press was particularly vicious, labeling Lewis a baby snatcher and cradle robber, urging a boycott of his concerts, and calling for his deportation as a child molester. Tour dates were cancelled, and Lewis and Myra were forced to flee back to the U.S. When their plane landed in New York, the U.S. press was no kinder than the British. Lewis had experienced a meteoric rise, and at the peak of his career, he rivaled Elvis. His career crashed and burned spectacularly, and his personal appearance fees dropped from the then princely sum of $10,000 a night to $250. He reinvented himself a decade later as a country singer, performing before audiences less offended by performers' wedding child brides, who also happened to be blood relatives.